Welcome to this webinar in the Financial Abuse Awareness Series. My name is Bill Mitchell. This series is part of the Financial Protections Project co-designed by the Queensland Government, Caxton Legal Centre and Townsville Community Law. The series is an online continuing professional development program that aims to raise financial industry awareness about the financial abuse of older persons. Before we begin, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This presentation is about risk and vulnerability, and it's the last in the knowledge series of modules. These slides are not read verbatim, but are paraphrased for emphasis. They are designed to be standalone, readable modules and contain references for deeper learning. So let's begin. Before we begin this module, let's take a moment to think about this statement from Lichtenberg. He says, while it's vitally important that older persons be protected from financial exploitation, it is equally important that they maintain financial autonomy. Both under and overprotection of older adults can have damaging consequences. Underprotection of older adults can lead to gross financial exploitation, including the ability to pay for necessary services. The dilemma is that overprotection can be equally costly. Think about how difficult it is to find a balance between autonomy and protection from abuse. Understanding these issues of risk and vulnerability allows advisors to identify who among their clients may be at risk of financial abuse and what key vulnerabilities are relevant. This module includes the topics listed below and the bullet points. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the learning outcomes for participants. There are a range of risk factors for elder abuse generally, and these, to some extent, include risk factors for financial abuse. Risk factors and indicators are predictive of the presence of abuse or an abusive situation. However, no one set of characteristics is determinant. It's often the interplay between all of them that provides an increased vulnerability. The World Health Organization sets out categories for risk factors for elder abuse. They include individual, relationship, community, socio-cultural and institutional. Individual risk factors include poor physical health and mental health. They also include the health of the abuser or perpetrator. There are a range of other factors including gender, living arrangements, and we'll get into those in a little bit more detail later. Risk factors within relationships include shared living situations and poor family relationships. Community risk factors include social isolation, including the reasons for social isolation in the first place. Socio-cultural factors that include risks of elder abuse include the way we see older persons as frail, weak and dependent, the erosion of bonds between generations, systems of inheritance and land rights, migration of young couples leaving older parents alone, and a lack of funds. Institutional risk factors include standards for healthcare, poorly trained staff or poor remuneration, the physical environment being deficient, or policies themselves. Working with older persons does necessitate an understanding of some level of risk and vulnerability. It's important to note that we talk about risk factors, which are individual stimuli or individual patterns of disease occurrence and the factors that influence these patterns. We also talk about protective factors, which have the reverse effect. They enhance the likelihood of positive outcomes and lessen the likelihood of negative consequences. And then vulnerability, which is a cluster of risk factors. You can see some examples of clustering risk factors there in that bullet point: age, sex, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, cognitive impairment, disability, depressive symptoms, social networks and social participation. Risk factors are often categorised into three characteristics: victims' characteristics, this includes behavioural triggers, perpetrators' characteristics, and environmental characteristics. Recognised risk factors for victims, these are older persons we're talking about, include those listed in bullet points. These are not the only risk factors for older persons, but include some of the ones that have been raised most commonly. It's important to know that risk factors do intersect and interact, and this is what we talk about when we talk about clusters. For example, someone's functional dependency. Their inability to perform activities of daily living, including self-care and medication, increases the probability of abuse. If you add to that the non-use of social services, which might lead to social isolation, then obviously the intersection of risk factors makes the likelihood of abuse higher. For adults aged 60 and over, losing at least one domain of instrumental activities of daily living was associated with a greater incidence of financial abuse. Give another example on the right-hand side about poor physical health. Take some time to read that. It's important to note that problems with reasoning and judgment may lead to older persons to fall prey to abuse because they don't fully understand the situation, or they may make more financial errors or enter more risky financial decisions. Depression can cause older persons to withdraw from family activities or familiar activities and is another risk factor. There are also some associations between gender roles and elder abuse. Importantly, declines in executive functioning, problems calculating and numeracy are increased risks for financial abuse. Financial fraud most often occurs when a vulnerable older person is solicited by a financial predator in the absence of a capable guardian. So efforts to reduce social isolation will enhance protection. It's important to note that financial abuse is the result of complex interactions between the older person and other individuals in their lives, so no one single risk factor can explain why some older persons are more susceptible. Being aware of the risk factors generally can be useful in screening processes. Obviously, having conversations with older people will often reveal the extent of their risk factors. Vulnerability, as we said earlier, is about a clustering of risk factors. These domains of vulnerability have been developed. They include dependency, physical vulnerabilities, cognitive vulnerabilities, and socio-emotional vulnerabilities. LOCKSS also suggests a number of factors contributing to age-associated financial vulnerability. They're very similar. They include cognitive and emotional, medical and functional, psychosocial, and environmental societal. Cognitive impairment, including through declines in executive functioning, calculation and numeracy, increases the risk of financial abuse. Age-related cognitive changes influence financial competence and financial exploitation risks in older persons. Mental illness and depression can see older persons withdraw from family activities and is another risk factor. In addition to risk factors and vulnerabilities, behavioural triggers are recognisable patterns of behaviour exhibited by older persons that might include, or indicate, I should say, memory loss and associated vulnerability. In the area of investments, there's an industry example here from Africa where they've looked at the issue of vulnerability and financial literacy. While allegations of elder abuse had been made in the case of Determination 255781, and while AFCA did not reach a finding that abuse had occurred, it's worth looking closely at that determination because it looks at several indicators of abuse. Conversely, in Determination 462666, despite large unusual transfers, steps were taken by the FSP to question the transactions. AFCA noted that just because the applicant was an older person was not in itself enough to indicate he was particularly vulnerable. They noted there must be compelling accompanying factors which would suggest the applicant was being financially exploited because of his age or his disposition. They noted that red flags may include customers appearing particularly frail or physically unwell, appearing confused, withdrawn or fearful, or remaining silent while withdrawing a large amount of money in the presence of another person, such as a family member. You can continue to read that case study in your own time. Here we see the matrix that sets out the behavioural triggers, including the loss and associated vulnerability to financial abuse. These things aren't all automatically indicators of vulnerability, but can be red flags for you and for FSPs or advisors to note that there is some likely vulnerability to financial abuse. They include functional status triggers, accidents as triggers, communication triggers, and cognition change triggers. Take the time at some stage to look closely at this table and the sorts of factual situations it sets out. Very important you realise these are all potentially triggers indicating a vulnerability to financial abuse. Here's a banking industry example about when AFCA's considered behavioural triggers as red flags in Determination 424946. In that case, the older person appeared dishevelled and withdrew a large and unusual amount of cash while accompanied by a new acquaintance. In this case, AFCA said the in this case, AFCA said the FSP should have taken steps to identify and protect the applicant from potential financial abuse. It should have discussed the transaction with the applicant separately from the third party. The issue of capacity, which we've already talked about before, is also a clear issue of vulnerability, especially those who are working with older persons regularly. There's a quote from the Financial Planning Research Journal here that sets out the concerns that the financial planning industry has about capacity. The increasing prevalence of these sorts of disorders, such as dementia, really does need to be raised by advisors within their own organisations to ensure they can develop new skills to deal with this issue. You've got to be able to recognise clients who may have this condition before advising on a range of financial matters. As we said earlier, we always presume capacity. We work to maximise and support the person, but there may be instances where you can't actually provide a service. Financial issues themselves are a risk factor for financial abuse, and these include a range of concepts you can see below: financial resilience, financial stress, capability, literacy, numeracy, financial wellbeing, and financial capacity. Financial circumstances can be risk factors for both victims, the older person, as well as the perpetrators or abusers. They cover a range of interrelated concepts, and we note that Queensland's Financial Inclusion Plan says that vulnerability to financial abuse is an outcome of financial stress, so financially resilient older persons are less prone to financial abuse. Financial resilience includes 4 factors: the person's economic resources, access to financial products, financial knowledge and behaviour, and social capital. Financial stress is a reflection of a lack of financial resilience. So improving financial resilience and reducing financial stress is a key strategy for preventing financial abuse. You can see also the definition of financial capability. It's a World Health Organization definition. Financial literacy is the ability to perform simple calculations, as well as the knowledge of financial concepts such as investments and things like compound interest. Financial literacy includes the ability to make informed judgments and to take effective decisions regarding the use and management of money. It's a complex combination of the person's skills, knowledge, attitudes, and their behaviours. An older person's financial literacy is a key risk factor for financial abuse. Numeracy is found to be a less significant predictor. However, it is important when it's in the company of other risk factors. So it's one of those risk factors that is often found clustering in someone's vulnerability, particularly if it's in the company of things like dependency, physical and mental health, or cognitive impairment. Financial wellbeing is a concept that talks about a person being able to meet their expenses and have some money left over. And you can see there are three domains or dimensions: being able to meet expenses and having some money left over, being in control, and feeling financially secure. And these are a good checklist of factors that you can talk to clients about to make sure that they have a level of financial wellbeing. It's one factor to look at. Poor financial wellbeing is a clear risk factor for financial abuse. Obviously, financial abuse erodes a person's financial wellbeing. Overall assessments of financial wellbeing can be made by financial counsellors. There's a range of common risk factors that might well be relevant in terms of determining vulnerability. That includes having been in low-paid or unskilled jobs throughout one's working life, being a single woman who's always been on a single, generally lower income, the divorce or death of a partner, a business failure, or also working for the majority of one's life before superannuation was compulsory. Each of these sorts of risk factors are also red flags for abuse. Financial capacity is the same as legal capacity. It's presumed for all matters, including financial matters. It is a complicated concept. Take some time to read that paragraph and think about how financial capacity might manifest in your older person's client group. I'll give you some time to read this quote by Lichtenberg, which summarises the issue very neatly. Lichtenberg's talking about the fact that financial capacity and financial exploitation or abuse are connected, that older adults' vulnerability is twofold. Number one, the potential loss of financial skills and financial judgment, and number two, the inability to detect and therefore prevent financial exploitation. Being aware of these financial circumstances, including the need for resilience, capabilities, financial literacy, actual literacy and numeracy, financial well-being and capacity, are also applicable within the context of any obligations the advisor might have under statutes such as the Corporations Act, the National Consumer Credit Protection Act, or under the Australian Consumer Law. So the sorts of obligations a person has to know their client will also bring into play the sorts of risk factors we've just talked about. But having a knowledge of these issues is about having a knowledge of your client. The other side of financial abuse is a complex picture, that is the side of the perpetrator or abuser. It's often evident that they are involved in polyvictimisation. They may be family members, carers, whether formal or informal, or trusted others. These persons often come within a cohort of close network or close social network members, and positive interactions with these persons can be a protective factor, while negative interactions is an accepted risk factor. Like family violence, women are overrepresented as victims and men are overrepresented as perpetrators. But this isn't the complete picture. A summary of the risk factors for perpetrators of elder abuse has included psychiatric illness or psychological problems, substance abuse, social isolation and lack of social support, childhood experiences of family violence, caregiver stress, domineering personality traits, financial problems, and dependency on the older person. Again, these factors are not exhaustive. Carer stress and burden is a recognised risk factor. Initially, it was thought to be quite a large risk factor. However, recent research and the experience of service providers who support those experiencing elder abuse has found that the caregiver model doesn't really adequately explain the majority of cases. Intergenerational tensions are very important, and they're well known to researchers. For example, inheritance in patients is a known driver of financial abuse. There are some perpetrator profiles that we can run through very quickly, and these include the romantic friend or companion, it can include friends, handymen and acquaintances. You can see each of these profiles has a slightly different description. It can include friends in groups or supported living, and also strangers. Here's an industry example from AFCA, Determination 424946, where AFCA noted the red flags that should be raised by the presence of new acquaintances. A bank should be in a position to recognise that a customer may be under the undue influence of another party, including where the customer is older or vulnerable and conducting an unusual transaction in the presence of a new acquaintance. Take some time to read those determinations, including 408, 496. It's important for advisors to appreciate that the perpetrator's actions fit within a range of behaviours, which include ageism, changing social norms, a sense of entitlement, the temptation of opportunity, and different forms of abuse, including unintentional and intentional abuse. There's more information on that at CPA Australia, which was done in conjunction with Seniors Rights Victoria. Before we leave, let's think about risk and vulnerability, victims and perpetrators. How many of those risk factors you saw appear in older persons you see day to day? How many of those vulnerabilities appear in the people you see day to day? Do you recognise those risk factors in people you may think have been abused in the past? Do you see any parallels between the need to recognise signs and symptoms, risks and vulnerabilities, and any professional obligations you might have, such as statutory obligations to know your client? Do you recognise any of the risk factors in those you think may have been perpetrators in the past? Thanks for listening to this webinar series. Feel free to download the PDF file for future reference. Thanks for joining us.